My little itty-bitty bruiser buddies.
United States heavyweight champion from Brazil.
The world's heavyweight champion from the AWA, Nick Bockwinkel.
The Midwest supporting, bruiser loving, positivity spreading, world's most dangerous podcast. Join former pro wrestler and promoter Dave Dynasty as he supports and promotes Midwest pro wrestling. Keep on growing with the Midwest Express. This is the Dave Dynasty Show.
And welcome to the Dave Dynasty Show. I am Dave Dynasty, your host, and I am joined this week with another special co-host, noted wrestling historian and author George Schire. George, how are you this evening?
I'm absolutely great, Dave. Thanks for having me on with you.
Sure, absolutely. I wanted to have you on for a while because a lot of people, when think about you, they obviously think about Minnesota wrestling, which leads you to think about the AWA, and you've literally written the book on Minnesota wrestling and the AWA. 4 of them, as a matter of fact, right? You've got four books out, I believe.
I do. I have a history of Minneapolis AWA wrestling. And when I say Minneapolis, I use that because the Minneapolis Wrestling Club was always the home for the AWA. So
right, yeah.
Basically, it covers Minneapolis AWA, which then encompasses all of the AWA cities that they promoted in.
Yeah, yeah, and then you also have worked on the AWA record books, right? Which I think now you guys are up through the 70s, correct? You got on the 3 books.
We do. We have. When you say we, my buddy Mark James out of Memphis, Tennessee, has been gracious to publish the books for me. And he, along with many of his great books, I mean, he's got, I think he's got something like 20-some books out or better.
Yeah, right.
And he's a great historian in his own right, but I wanted to do the AWA results history. And, you know, Dave, I've always been fascinated with results of wrestling matches all through the decades because if you follow them match by match by match, they tell a wrestler's story.
Right, yeah.
And that's something a lot of people don't get right away. They say, well, you did a book with results in it. But if you read through it and you follow, you can pick out any wrestler in those results. Mm-hmm. And if you follow them, you get their career history, not only for a territory, but I've also compiled and researched about 25 wrestlers' lifetime results records.
Right.
From the beginning of their careers through the end of their careers. Now, let me point one thing out when I say that. It's impossible to always have every single match.
Correct.
That's one of the fascinating things about researching because just when you think you've got all the matches of a wrestler in a certain territory, wow, all of a sudden you come across 1 or 2 matches and it's like, I don't know, for lack of a better description, when you're a little kid and you get that Christmas present from Santa Claus that you've been waiting for. Just great. It's that great feeling.
Yeah.
But probably 90 to 95% of these wrestlers that I have done their life records for, I have basically about 90% of their matches.
Yeah. Yeah. I understand. I spend more hours than I probably care to admit on newspapers.com. And all the time you'll see on the message boards, the like-minded guys that do that as well. And then every once in a while, someone will pop up with some results or a card, an advertised card, and they'll think, hey, what about this one? We've never, has anybody ever found this one before? And every once in a while, when one turns up, it's a big deal. It's a lot of fun when something like that turns up, and then it's like piecing together history again and painting that picture. So
it really is, And I started out. I mean, for some of the younger fans out there, I've been following wrestling since the mid-1950s.
Yeah.
And if you want to know how old I am, I'm 67 years old. So back in the mid-50s, I was 5-6 years old.
Yeah.
And I wasn't into results and things like that as a little kid. But as I got into my teen years, into the 60s, that's when I started to want to know, you could pick out a name, Vern Gagne. Mm-hmm. And you could say, gee, I want to know where Vern wrestled before and where does he wrestle next week and where does he wrestle next month and where did he wrestle 2 years ago and when did he start? in the business, and how many territories has he been in?
Yeah.
And in those days, I mean, I was a crazy kid in high school because I'd spend so much time in the school library and at our city library going through old newspapers and going through microfiche and things, and it was a tedious job, but it was so much fun. And today, you know, it's a little bit easier today because, like you mentioned a moment ago, a guy can Google something, go on the internet, and you can find stuff.
Yeah.
The only flaw in that, and I really caution folks to not always believe what you see on the internet because, believe me, there are so many errors.
Yeah.
And when you find that match or two of a particular wrestler, then it becomes important to verify that they indeed were in that city on that date in that year. Sometimes you'll find that it's listed there, but maybe the wrestler didn't show up or he was, you know, someone subbed for him.
Yeah.
And so it's important just because the lineup or the clipping shows the wrestler, we need to verify that they were there.
Yeah.
And there again, there's more research that needs to be done.
Yeah.
So a lot of the internet today is not always accurate, and that's especially true for title histories and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's so much out there on these title histories that if you take it at face value, a lot of times you're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite things when I'm doing research, and they're very hard to find a lot of times, is the old some of the old fanzines that they, or whatever they call, and because a lot of those are, you know,
bulletins.
Yeah, the bulletins, right? Correct. Where, I mean, because those are put out by fans, and they're typically, you know, a lot of results heavy, but those are typically firsthand accounts of people that were actually there at the shows, usually submitting those and sending those in for those and things. So you know, there's a lot of information. Like I said, they're hard to come by, but a lot of times, but in this day and age. But.
And you know, that was an interesting thing too, because again, back in my era, back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, there were tons. We didn't have the internet, as I pointed out. We didn't have the access that we do today. And we had to rely on those fan club bulletins. There were tons. You know, a wrestler would have a fan do a bulletin for him, and they would publish results, like you say, from his matches in their territory, and they were first-hand accounts.
Yeah.
And we know they're accurate because many of these people that did these bulletins have become what we refer to today, and I'm in that group, historians.
That's right.
People that lived it and followed it, recorded it, and want to see it right. And I'll tell you this, I can't even put into numbers the times that I've had fans take me wrong, in the sense that I will get on them if they insist something is right when I know it's wrong when it comes to results or a title situation.
Yeah.
And I can always go back and show them the proof with clippings or actual programs. That's one of the things I started doing as a kid. When I was in my teens, I started not only buying a program at the wrestling cards that I attended, but I would buy 10 or 12 or 15 additional programs, and then I would send a program to St. Louis to a friend or a fan or even promoters, and I would get their program in return.
Yeah.
And I would do that to Houston and Dallas and Miami and San Francisco, and the list goes on.
Yeah.
So each week I would be getting all of these programs, and I knew where everybody was. And in that era, that was unheard of.
Yeah.
Because, number one, it was a kayfabe era where promoters would go out of, well, the wrestlers too, but they would go out of their way to convince fans that what happened in their city was the elite, the best wrestlers, the best cards, and it was so much fun when we had a great wrestling announcer on our local program here in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Marty ONeil. Marty was so good, so unassuming. He was just professional. And he'd come on the air, you know, and he'd say, fans, Pepper Gomez has been put out of action by Lars Anderson. And I would just kind of chuckle because I just got a program the day before that says Pepper Gomez is now wrestling in San Francisco and he's in the main event against Ray Stevens.
Yeah.
So But I kept quiet.
Yeah.
I would go to school in those days. I was in high school, and the kids would come around and, Shire, you follow that phony stuff. That's where I'd leave the conversation.
Yeah.
Because if they didn't understand it, there was no reason for me to try to argue with them.
Right.
Now, if they understood it, then they got it. They wanted to talk about it, and they were excited when you could share something with them. But I never revealed match results or things that I knew. I was never one of those fans that went to the matches and shout out a wrestler's name that he used in a different territory, or if he was a mask guy, I didn't shout out his name.
Yeah.
I followed what they wanted. I kept it quiet.
Yeah.
And it was fun now.
Yeah.
It was fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you mentioned Marty ONeil. You didn't you actually do some traveling with Marty?
Oh, I sure did. Yeah. I sure did. And when I say he's unassuming, here I was in 1967, and I'm 16 years old, not quite ready to get my driver's license yet. And at that point in time, I had to always rely on my dad to get me to the matches. My dad wasn't really a fan.
Yeah.
So I didn't get to all the cards that I wanted to, and I couldn't wait to get my driver's license. But as I'd mentioned to you, I would buy additional programs, and I would start to collect from other territories. And Marty ONeil, he was one of those guys where he'd see you at the matches on a regular basis. And I used to have a corner seat, sort of close to ringside, right around, we're across from the table where he'd sit at the timekeeper's table. And he'd come to the match, or he'd come up to the ring, and he'd say, hey there, young fella, how you doing? And he'd get into the ring. Well, this goes on for a period of time, and he'd see me with my programs, and he actually asked me one time, he said, I'm just curious, why do you buy so many copies of the program? And I told him the story. He says, I can't even believe that anybody would do that. That's incredible. And then he said to me, he says, I have to go to small towns once in a while, and we had small town cards. They called them spot shows in the day,
right,
where they'd won a card in a local high school gymnasium or the local National Guard armory in smaller towns. And so Marty would go there to, be the guest ring announcer, and he asked me if I wanted to ride along with him. And that's really how it started. So for the summer of 67, I was, traveling about every few days. I was going with Marty ONeil. And I mean, and I got to admit to you, I was in awe, Marty ONeil. It was like he's on TV, as a kid would do. So that kind of started it. And then once that happened, I was able to, get around the wrestlers. And it was such a close-knit fraternity that if the wrestlers didn't trust you or they thought you were just an average-type fan or something, I mean, they would, maintain their secrecy.
Right.
But eventually, the AWA guys, Red Bastien was one of the first ones. And he was one of the first, he was the first guy that allowed me to come into the locker room with him. And he told the boys in the locker room, when I walked in there, I remember to this day how they silenced up, because there's a fan in here. Mm-hmm. And Red said, the boy's good. The boy, he's okay. And you kind of get talking with him. And from there, it really became easy. They knew that I really tried to show them that I wasn't going to reveal what I knew or how I knew it, that I was on their side. And that's how it all started.
Yeah. And eventually, though, you also did some writing for Wrestling Review, Wrestling Monthly, some of these Norm Keizer magazines. And I'm always fascinated when you look through these old magazines, some of the names you see in, the Jim Cornettes, the Eddie Gilberts, the Jim Melbys, all these guys that participated and wrote for these magazines and what they ended up doing in the business. How did you end up writing for some of these magazines and working for them?
Well, part of it was because everybody knew me in the AWA, but the other side of it was, as you mentioned, Jim Melby. Mm-hmm. And I had met Jim Melby, ironically, as we mentioned his name, it's 50 years ago this month, 1968, that Jim was a fan, just like I was. In 1968, I was 17 years old. Jim Melby was 19. He was 2 years older than I was. Mm-hmm. And there was a magazine that was being put out at the time called Matt Mania by a guy named Burt Ray. Mm-hmm. And at that time period, and I don't know if you've ever seen a Matt Mania, but they are, for that time period, they were state-of-the-art because they covered wrestling all over the country. So a fan in the AWA could buy that magazine and they could find out what was going, the wrestlers that were in the Carolinas or down in Florida or Texas or wherever it might be.
Yeah.
And so Mel B was friends with Burt Ray, long story short. Burt gave up the magazine for whatever reasons that were going on in his life at the time, and Jim decided that he was going to take over the membership so that the fans got their money's worth. And he came out with a bulletin called Wrestling Results. Mm-hmm. And it really changed the format of what Matt Mania was. I had subscribed to Matt Mania, and when I got my first issue, it was Wrestling Results with an explanation that Matt Mania was no more. And I will tell you, I was very disappointed. And again, I'm 17 years old.
Yeah.
I was very disappointed. And I wrote Jim Mel B a letter. And I told him of my disappointment. The bulletin that he had sent was very amateurish, and I still have all the copies. Man, I have tons of fan club bulletins from that era.
Yeah.
But the Wrestling Results bulletin was very amateur in appearance, and I just was disappointed. So I sent him this letter. Well, I didn't hear anything for about, 2 weeks, and one night my phone rang, and it was Jim Mel B. He called me. Well, here I find out he lived right in he lived in St. Paul. I was in a suburb of St. Paul living at the time. And we talked for 2 hours. We realized that we were fans for the same period of time. We both started following wrestling in the 50s. And Jim at the time was also writing for Norman Keatzer's Wrestling News magazine. Mm-hmm. And so that's how it started. I just got involved with them. Jim and I became the best of friends. We attended matches together, hundreds of them, both on the road and around our Twin Cities here. And we also had baseball in common. We loved baseball. We had old movies and TV. We talked about music. He was just a great guy.
Yeah.
And sadly, he left us, passed away February of 2007.
Yeah.
From a long, many-decade struggle with diabetes. And but he was a good man. He taught me about results, and that's where it started with my fascination to want to do results because, again, they tell such interesting stories.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people may not be familiar with his name, honestly, some of the newer fans, but yeah, I mean, he's so important. Cauliflower Alley Club names their Historian Award after him. And so, how important is he to historians and what's, the years that followed and what he's done?
Well, here's the thing with the Historian Award. To label yourself as an historian, sometimes it can sound like you're being self-serving, but it is something that you earn. Mm-hmm. And when the wrestlers call you and ask you, when did I wrestle in Australia, or how many months was I in Australia, or when did I wrestle Buddy Rogers, or that sort of thing, that's when you know you've earned not only the wrestler's respect, but you realize that you are a historian because you can rattle this stuff off.
Yeah.
And in the case of Jim Mel B, when he passed away, I was on the executive board at the time, board of directors for the Cauliflower Alley Club.
Yeah.
And Jim was also on the board before he passed. Well, at the April meeting after his passing, at the annual reunion, I suggested to the board that we come up with a historian award to honor guys like Jim Mel B. I will be totally honest with you, and I could put my hand on a Bible when I tell you this. I never had any intent that I would be included in that group of recognition at some point, but I was honored as the historian of the year at their 2013 reunion.
Yeah.
But going back to 2007, in 2008 we honored the first historian, and that was my buddy Scott Teal from Tennessee. And Scott Teal, Crowbar Press, if fans want to look at some absolutely incredible history with books, Scott Teal is the man.
Yeah,
I've known Scott since 1970.
Yeah, we plug Screwbar Press on this show all the time. I talk about it all the time. Yeah, I couldn't even count how many of Scott's books I have here on my shelves. I've got so many. It's phenomenal, the work he does.
So the key thing is with all of the historians is we had Mel B, we had Tom Burke, we had Scott Teal, we had J. Michael Kenyon, and the list just goes on. We got Mark Hewitt, Mark James. I mean, there's so many of them, and all through the decades, they've done pretty much the same thing I've done, where we are interested in making sure that the history of professional wrestling is recorded accurately. And I'm going to add something here, because oftentimes, and I always say I don't have any disrespect to any wrestler when I say this, but sometimes the wrestlers are the worst ones to ask about history of their careers, because they don't remember everything that happened in the chronological order. A lot of times they don't even remember opponents and different situations and the angles that they have, the storylines. And it's because, as Nick Bockwinkel explained it to me a couple of times, he said, we went to wrestling. We went to the card. We hoped we got paid, because there were some promoters out there that would try to, pull fast ones on the wrestlers, pay them less than what they'd promised, or sometimes not pay them at all.
Yep, right.
So Nick says, go to the card. We wrestle. We hope we get paid. We go back to the hotel with a case of beer and some bologna and bread for sandwiches. We take care of that, go to bed, get up the next morning, drive 600 miles to the next town, and do the same thing that night. Now, when you look at their life results records, in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and well into the 80s, these guys traveled the highways of the United States on a nightly basis.
Right.
And as they'll tell you, they'd put 4 or 5 or 6 of them into an Oldsmobile 98 and share expenses to get to the next town. But as Nick said, they never took the time to save a program that they were on, or collect a program or a magazine that they may have had their article in.
Yeah.
They never saved any of that stuff. Some of them never even saved pictures or anything.
Yeah.
So when they come across the historians, these guys are in awe. I don't believe you have all this stuff, they say. And, right now as I'm talking to you, I'm walking around in my wrestling room at my home, and it is a mini museum.
Yeah, right.
It's ceiling to floor, pictures, posters framed, ceiling to floor, wall to wall. Guys like Bockwinkel, Von Raschke, Red Bastien, the Destroyer Dick Beyer, Greg Gagne, so many others, they've actually been here. And they just oh my God.
Yep.
And like they say, they never saved it. So a lot of times it's been fun, because I can give them a copy of something. I'll make them a copy of a story, or many times I'll give them their life record. And they really enjoy that. And that's the fun of being a historian. The other side of it is just making sure that it's accurate. Right.
And then you serve as the historian chairman, right, for the Cauliflower Alley Club. Do you find after, you guys have honored, the obvious names. Do you find that each passing year it's harder and harder to find guys that you can label as a historian and look at and honor?
Yes and no. Now that we've had the Historian Award, there were a couple of years when Cauliflower Alley did not actually have a Historian Award at the reunion. But since 2008, that was the first year, we've honored about, 11 guys. Mm-hmm. And this past year, and I am the chairman of the committee that sets up the ballots, and we get the ballots out, and then all of the way it works is all of the previous historian award winners get to vote, and we do it on a reverse number system, on a 1, 2, 3 order. So the ballot will have names of candidates, they will list their number one choice, and if with that number one choice, the vote gets 3 points. And they list their number two choice, he gets 2 points. They list their number 3 choice, he gets 1 point. Right. Well, when all these ballots come back, and these go out to other historians too, and when they come back, then you just tally up the points and we get our winner. Mm-hmm. We have got a winner for 2019.
Okay.
And I think Cauliflower Alley has announced it on their website. I haven't been in there recently, so I'm not going to say who it is if they haven't, but we do have a winner.
Yeah, okay.
Well-deserved, I would point out.
Yeah. And you also have, in the past, played a role in a few professional wrestling Hall of Fames, including the one in Iowa and in Texas. How crucial do you see these Hall of Fames as being part of that historian culture and preserving the history and promoting the history?
Well, one of the things that the Hall of Fames do is I am on the nominating board of the George Tragos Luthez Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in Waterloo, Iowa.
Right.
So each year I get a ballot and I vote. With that particular museum, I don't have really any other input, but I am on their nominating committee.
Okay.
With the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in Wichita Falls, Texas, which is the one that moved from Amsterdam, New York, a few years ago.
Yeah.
For the last 2 years, I served as the committee chairman to create the ballot along with 2 other historians each year. And we make it a committee of 3 to really come up with why this guy belongs in the Hall of Fame and not this guy, at least at this time. Why is this one better?
Yeah.
And look at the merits. The key thing, Dave, is that, a lot of people, I always tease and I say, you know what, if you asked me, just as a fan, if I put my fan shoes on for a moment, you asked me who my favorite wrestler was as a kid when I was 12, 13 years old, I would say Moose Evans. and everybody you say that to, they go, who? Moose who?
Right.
Okay. But as a 12-year-old kid, Moose Evans was just in my eyes, he was bigger than life. He was a phenomenal wrestler. But in the scheme of things, just because he's my favorite wrestler doesn't necessarily make him Hall of Fame material.
Right.
So what we do is we have to make sure we pull our personal feelings out of it. It isn't about my favorite team or my favorite wrestler. It's about why this wrestler belongs in there versus this wrestler or belongs on the ballot. Now, all of this said, I want to be fair here and say that I have a tremendous amount of respect because there are so many of the young, and this isn't a put down, but I make this comment. There are so many of the younger generation fans, the fans that didn't live let's say before 1985, going back, and don't understand the rich history of all these wrestlers. They think today that just because some wrestler held a title for 19 different times, that he should be in the Hall of Fame.
Right.
Well, I'm not saying he shouldn't be, but what about a guy like, and I'm going to throw a name out to you, and you tell me if you've heard of him. What about a name like Jack Bent?
No, never heard of Jack Bent.
Okay, now Jack Bent never held any titles. He was what you would refer to as a journeyman. He spent a few decades in the business. He was one of these guys that was a real type shooter, a hooker, whatever you wanted to refer to him as. He was the real deal.
Right.
And Jack Bent could go in and make any wrestler look better than he was. And that was Jack's role in the majority of his career, where he would work the preliminaries or the openers, and he'd make someone else look better than they were. And Jack never won, or not often. He had his time for a short time. But when you throw that name out there, people say, well, he never held a title or he never did this. Well, in my eyes, a guy like Jack Bent still belongs at some point in the Hall of Fame or some sort of recognition. So when I look at wrestlers, I say that I respect them for lacing up their boots, putting on their trunks, going in that ring, and throwing their bodies around as they did, entertaining the fans, going home and nursing the wound or the injuries and the aches and the pains that they did for this phony sport. And today, if you go to Cauliflower Alley Club for all of the wrestlers or any of these halls of fame, when you see these wrestlers that are still with us in the upper years, they're limping, they can hardly move, they're on walkers, they've had knee replacements, hip replacements, shoulder replacements, sometimes ankles are fused, and all of these things are because they were in this phony sport.
Right.
And so that's why wrestlers used to get upset when you'd say, well, it's fake, because you've heard the name Jim Brunzell.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Jim Brunzell, one of the most spectacular drop kicks in wrestling. He was known as Jumping Jim Brunzell. And every night when Jim would wrestle, he'd deliver that drop kick. And when he delivered the drop kick, you know, it takes the two wrestlers to work together, and Jim has to make contact with the opponent to make it so he could fall to the mat.
Yeah.
And when he falls, he lands on his shoulder night after night, match after match. In 2010, so 8 years ago, Jimmy had to have shoulder replacement surgery. And I asked him, I said, Jim, how do you end up with shoulder replacement? And I can tell you exactly what he said to me. He looked at me and he put his fingers up in the quotation mark stance. He says, remember all those phony drop kicks I gave?
Yeah.
He paid the price for his shoulders. And that's, you know, that's what the wrestlers, we know the matches were predetermined. We know that they worked out the finishes. We know that they protected each other in the ring and they didn't really hurt each other, at least intentionally. And when you see them after the fact and to be called fake, I think even today, I say, you know what? Those that say wrestling is fake, they truly don't understand it, because it's the greatest art form there is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's phenomenal.
Absolutely.
What they do.
Yeah.
And how well they do it.
Yeah. As a historian and someone who's clearly, you know, concerned about the writing of history and the accuracy of the history and trying to be as complete as we can, something that I feel is kind of a concern is now the WWE owning so many of the tape libraries. Do you feel that there's this, they're kind of writing their own history here with what they show and how they edit and the pieces they're putting out there? Do you ever feel that concern that with them controlling so much of this footage that perhaps they're writing the story in their favor now?
Well, I definitely do, and they have been from the beginning. You know, if you look back to 1985, when the expansion era started, when Vince McMahon started going into the territories and rating their talent, when he brought these guys into his territory at the time, many of them came in without any knowledge of their previous past. He brought them in as under sometimes different names or in a different character. He didn't acknowledge that they had been champion or champions in other territories. He wanted it to be Vince McMahon's creation of the wrestler. Do I find that entirely bad? Not necessarily, because if you go back and look at history, many promoters wanted to bring in a wrestler, but they didn't want the wrestler that had been around the circuit that fans would have read about in the magazines or knew existed. So sometimes they would create a new persona, a new character for him. A good example of that is the world-famous destroyer, Dick Beyer. Mm-hmm. You know, he put that mask on in 1962, and Dick became one of the rare individuals who realized that as Dick Beyer for 10 years or 8 years prior, he was just a run-of-the-mill wrestler. He wasn't really going anywhere as a babyface.
Right.
And even though he was an absolutely great amateur wrestler and could give you a good solid match, but there wasn't any color or charisma there. So when he put that mask on, Dick realized that this was his ticket to making it to the big time, and he vowed And promoters worked with him on this because he drew money. And bottom line is, with any wrestler, if they drew you money, you wanted to use them. And Dick drew money with the mask, but his gimmick was he would unmask only if he were defeated. And he had, submission falls or different criteria that he threw in at different times. But the behind-the-scenes story was the Destroyer was never going to unmask. And promoters knew that. So when they brought in Dick Beyer as the Destroyer, they had little or no hope of him ever taking that mask off or being unmasked.
Right.
Well, in 1967, 5 years into his Destroyer career, Vern Gagne wrestled the Destroyer in Chicago when Destroyer was working out of Dick the Bruiser's Indianapolis WWA group.
Mm-hmm.
And Chicago had the unique situation where, because Vern Gagne and Bruiser owned Chicago together, the city, for promoting, fans in that city got the privilege of seeing some WWA talent and also AWA talent on those cards. So They saw matches that the average AWA fan never saw, and the same for the WWA. So here Vern Gagne wrestles the Destroyer. Well, and this story's been told not only in my Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling book, but also in Dick Beyer's Mask Decisions book, where Vern wanted Dick to come into Minneapolis, again, the AWA. And the discussion came out that, at some point when you're ready to leave the territory, would you unmask? Dick said no. So Vern and Dick decided, we can pull this off, but we'll bring you in under a different name and a different character altogether.
Right.
So lo and behold, in August of 67, we get Dr. X.
Right, yeah.
A completely different ring outfit, a completely different mask, and he was Dr. X. Now, when it came time for Dick to leave 3 years later, Dick advised Vern he wanted to leave for a year, and Vern says, well, we want to pull off an unmasking then. Dick agreed because Dr. X got unmasked, not the Destroyer.
Right.
And that's the way these guys rationalized it. But the Destroyer went on to wrestle in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Mexico for the next year, came back as Dr. X for a little bit in 72, and then he continued on as the Destroyer till the end of his career, a lot of it done in Japan.
Yeah.
But that was his income. But you had a different persona there, so you brought him in under a different name.
Yeah.
There were things like we had a guy named Frank Shields who wrestled for many years, had main events here and there, wasn't a top draw, tough guy, put on a good show for the fans, wrestled as the Boston Bruiser for a while. He was the Wrecker in Texas, but always it was Frank Shields.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in 1970, there was you have to go back and look at this in the history books, but there was one of the unions that the truck drivers belonged to, semi-truck drivers, was on strike.
Yeah.
So Frank Shields comes into Minneapolis and pulls off this gimmick that he's an out-of-work truck driver due to the strike. He calls himself Bad Boy Bolinski.
Yep.
And he said that he came to wrestling during the strike. Now, he'd already avoided his entire past. He'd been in the business for 10 or 12 years before this.
Right.
And he comes in, and he says he is... he decided that he'd rather get paid to beat up bullies than beating them for nothing on the docks, the loading docks where the trucks were.
Yeah.
Well, it was a great gimmick, and it went over. The only thing that changed was that Vern wanted him to be a bad boy, thus the name, Bad Boy Bolinski. But for some reason, the fans dictated a change, because when Bad Boy Bolinski would come into the ring in his initial matches, he was dressed in his jeans and his blue truck driver shirt and his truck driving cap, and the fans would cheer him instead of boo him.
Right.
Now, what happened was that the fans were relating to this average blue-collar worker. Truck drivers. What more in America is more American than the truck driver?
Right, yeah.
You know, the over-the-road trucker. They bring us our food. They bring us our beds, our furniture. You name it, it comes by truck and train. So Belinsky became a good guy. And they associated him real quick with the Crusher, who was the AWA's most popular at the time.
Yep.
So automatically Belinsky becomes a good baby face, and the rest is history.
Yep.
And that's how they create these characters. Sometimes the wrestlers would come up with them. Sometimes the promoter would come up with a gimmick. But most of the time it was just, I'm in a new territory, I got a new start, and we're going to do something different with you.
Right.
And nobody else knew.
Yep, that's right.
So,
yeah, well, let's shift gears a little bit, because on this episode also we have a second part of our interview with Les Thatcher, and that's a guy you've known for a long, long time. Tell us about meeting Les and your friendship you've developed with him over the years.
Les Thatcher wrestled in the AWA back in the 60s, and he was, for the most part, rather than, you know, one of the things that guys like Scott Teal and some of the other historians we don't like to call them jobbers, even
right.
That's what they did. They went in the ring and did a job for another wrestler. And the wrestlers called themselves jobbers, too.
Yeah.
But we call them enhancement talent.
Right.
So Les Thatcher, during his stint in the AWA back in the late 60s, was enhancement talent. And I liked him as a good wrestler. He always gave a good account of himself. And I had the chance to see him in some of my travels then in other cities. Les had a really, really good career. He wasn't the biggest guy in the business, you know, and that's probably the major difference between wrestling today, the product that's out there, and the product that we had, I'll say pre-85.
Right, sure.
You didn't have to be 6'9" and built like the proverbial brick, you know what.
Yeah.
And have, you know, muscles on top of muscles. That wasn't a requirement. What you had to be was a good, sound wrestler who could excite fans, and Les Thatcher was one of those guys. I got to know Les through what used to be, we mentioned fan clubs earlier. Mm-hmm. There was an organization called the Wrestling Fans International Association.
Sure. Yeah.
And what they would do is on an annual basis, they would go into a territory, a different territory every year. They would work with the promotion to have a wrestling card, have their annual convention at this city, and they would honor certain wrestlers within the promotion, you know, Wrestler of the Year or Tag Team of the Year, Promoter of the Year. And the fans from different cities would come to this convention, and you know, that was like one of the earliest chances where people had a chance to meet the wrestlers. And that was in the very early years of the WFIA. That's where I met Les Thatcher. And Les and I would sit around, you know, you'd go to these reunions and you'd sit around in the bar afterwards and you'd chat and talk. And Les could tell you that him and I, we closed a few places up just talking for hours on end. One night, a bunch of the folks went to a spot show in one of the cities. I think it was Kansas City. Yes, it was. Kansas City we were at. And Les and I, we stayed back. I don't remember what the reason was. We stayed back and we were in the bar. And when they left at 7 or something in the evening, Les and I were still in the bar at 5 in the morning. I mean, we just chatted. And he's just a good guy.
Yeah.
And, you know, again, when we talk about Hall of Fame candidates, Les Thatcher has not been put into any halls of fame.
Right.
I don't say this because I consider him a good friend. I say this because he truly deserves to be at some point, get him in there.
Yep.
And one of the things that we've done, again, going back to the halls of fame, is I like to get the guys in before they're dead.
Sure, yeah, of course.
I think that's important. Posthumous is great, but you know, Les is getting up there. He's close. I think he's 80-something.
Yeah.
And, you know, it'd be great if he could come to the reunion banquet and collect his award. And, you know, that's what it's all about.
Sure.
So there are just so many that deserve it.
Yeah.
And we'll never run out of talent.
Right.
Seriously.
Of course. Well, George, I think we're going to wrap this up. Thank you for coming on and recording with us. And again, I'd like to make sure we plug your books, Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, and then along with the 3 separate editions of the AWA record book for the 1960s, and then part 1s and part 2 from the 1970s. You can find all those on Amazon.com. So make sure you go out and order them. And where else, George, if people wanted to follow what you're doing and look at some of your work, where can they see some of that out there besides your books?
Well, the books, obviously, and I would point out, too, that the Minnesota Golden Age book can be purchased at any major bookstore, Barnes & Noble, of course, and then all the bookstores,
sure, okay,
as well as Amazon.
Okay. So,
and then I will have, down the road, I'm diligently working on the 80s results.
Okay.
So there's going to be 2 more books at this point because the early half of the 80s is just way too much for one book.
Right, yeah.
And then the last half of the 80s, that's going to be, well, that's like working on a funeral for a deceased friend.
Yeah.
Because the AWA had such a sad demise after the last 2 or 3 years of its existence.
Yeah.
But I do tell the stories in there about trivia notes and things in the results books. So,
yep.
Yeah, Amazon.com.
Yep. All right. Well, absolutely. Well, George, thank you for joining us and telling us these stories and sharing your memories. Very, very much appreciate you coming on. And we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll have part 2 of that interview with Les Thatcher. So stick around. If you are looking for the best books, DVDs, and posters on classic wrestling nostalgia, then you want to visit CrowbarPress.com. There are literally dozens of titles there, including biographies of the likes of Bruiser Brody, Ole Anderson, Ivan Koloff, and of course, Dick the Bruiser, as we've spoke about here on the Dave Dynasty Show. You want to visit CrowbarPress.com for all of your classic wrestling nostalgia needs. Again, that is CrowbarPress.com.
You know, when I left the Maritimes, I didn't, now Rudy had asked me, he said, I'd like you to come back and help me in the office, help produce the television, and administrative, but he didn't want me to wrestle. And I said, well, I was 10 years in at the time, right? And I said, I still got a few bumps, and I was having a good time wrestling too. And so I just passed on it, Mm-hmm. And so anyway, so we were in the office, this was in Charlotte, was in the office, and Lord Littlebrook, who had been up in the Maritimes with a couple of the other midgets during the summer the year before, and so he and I were in Mr. Crockett's office, and Brooks said to Mr. Crockett, why isn't Les on your TV? And Jim looked at him and said, what do you mean? He's on my TV. No, Mr. Crockett, he said, I mean as an announcer.
Yeah.
He did Rudy's TV up in the Maritimes and did an amazing job. We were up there and we worked with him and so forth. And Mr. Crockett looked at me. He said, well, I didn't know that. I said, well, it just never came up. I never thought that you, that you cared. So so then we started working me in. I was, besides wrestling, was, starting. Actually, how that whole started was I was sitting in with, like Bill Ward was Big Bill Ward was a local celebrity on Channel 3 in Charlotte, but he also did had been doing the TV there, wrestling for a number of years. But Bill, in the middle of a hot angle, he might be wishing Miss Mary Jones a happy 86th birthday, who was a big fan. And so initially for Mr. Crockett, I sat in with Charlie Harville in High Point some and up in Raleigh as well and in Charlotte. It just depended where they needed me or wanted me. But the point was I knew I knew what the angles were and what was going to happen. And so my job was, even if Big Bill or whoever was trying to wish Hattie Jones happy birthday, I was to talk over him and say, look at that going, and get the hot angle over. So
right.
That's how the whole TV thing started and the magazine thing as well. So that was the way she bounced.
Yeah. So where were you working then after the Carolinas? I mean, how much longer did you work in ring and where all were you working there after that?
Well, my God, the hats that I wore. I started doing the magazines with Jim there and was doing TV, and then Mr. Crockett passed away.
Right.
And so Jimmy Jr. Took over the reins, and so I was still doing the magazine and wrestling, doing the TV. And then the war in Atlanta started, Ann Gunkel and Tom Ernesto, and they split, and all the, so the whole thing, the Gunkel promotion versus the NWA. So Jack Briscoe was tied in with the NWA. So he called me and he said, I want you to come down here, work in the office, handle the programs, and do the color with Gordon. Plus, you come. The idea was for me to go in at first as I was injured, which I wasn't, but that's why I was doing the TV only, right? And then they were going to work me into wrestling. And Leo had an idea. Bobby Shane was one of the top heels in the territory at the time. He was going to work an angle off the TV and put Bobby in a program in the major towns. So anyway. Jack, we want you to do this, and here's what, you'll get a piece of the action off the programs, plus you get a salary for the office and this and that and the other thing. So I thought, yeah, okay, that's good, and I could still do the Crockett program. At the time, we weren't doing the big fancy magazine. We were just doing like an 8-page. But I could do that anywhere, right? Because, as far as writing it and laying it out and mail it in mass to the Charlotte office, and they could have it printed. So anyway, Jimmy didn't want me to go, Jimmy Crockett. And no, he said, I want to keep him here. So Jack's a little upset by that. And I don't want to get in the middle of the politics of the thing. I'm happy either way.
Yeah.
The opportunity to work with Gordon and share the desk with him was intriguing to me, and working in the office there. So anyway, so then I get a call from Eddie Graham, who was besides being the owner in Tampa, and he also had a piece of the action in Atlanta during the war. And so Eddie said, we're going to get you to Atlanta. And I said, well, I don't want to get in the middle of some political struggle here. He said, well, here's what you're going to do. He said, you're going to give your notice to Jimmy that you're coming to Tampa to wrestle for me. He said, on your way to Tampa, you're going to drop your furniture off in Atlanta. And so then you'll come down here and wrestle for a month or so, and then you'll go back to Atlanta and do what we wanted you to do there to begin with.
Oh, well.
And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is again, I'm not political to begin with, so I'm not a manipulator in that respect. So I'm thinking, I don't want to burn the bridge here and everything. So anyway, finally. We never had to do that because Jack was able to convince Jimmy to let me come down there. So actually, the first TV that I did in Atlanta with Gordon was the Saturday after Harley put the strap on Jack.
Okay, yeah.
And that was that. In fact, that's a match between Bill Watts and Tim Woods, Mr. Wrestling, is floating around on the internet somewhere. Probably YouTube or wherever. That's the first show that Gordon and I had ever done together.
Yeah.
So that's how I ended up down there in the midst of that whole thing. So.
Yeah. So what was it like working with Gordon once you actually got there and stuff?
It was good. I've been as far as a commentator, I've been the play-by-play guy. I've been the color guy, but I'm blessed to have worked with Gordon Soley, Bob Cottle, Lance Russell, Ed Capral, Charlie Platt, and Jim Ross.
Yeah.
I don't know that if there's a Mount Rushmore and those guys aren't on it, I'm not sure.
That's right,
who would be. And it's just, as I've said several times, and I'll probably say it several times before you and I are done, I'm just, I'm blessed to have worked with the best of the best, whether it's behind the desk doing commentary or in the ring.
Yeah.
And, I've had a great time doing it too. But yeah, so it was, and of course, Gordon, or JR will tell you that Gordon is the yardstick. We both have said we learned a lot from Gordon.
Yeah.
And, it's any of those guys. And there was never, I've had people say, well, how did you guys work it in? I said, it was never, they're professionals, and I try to be, and it was never a break-in period. We sat down and we did shows.
Yeah.
A funny example, I don't know if you've ever seen The Night of Legends from Smoky Mountain.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, that was the first time JR and I'd ever worked together.
Okay.
And, we had met. We weren't, we'd never worked at, like when WCW was in Cincinnati and I'd go over to the old garden and visit, I'd talk to him a few minutes or something, but we had never worked together till that show.
Yeah.
So anyway, at intermission, he and I went to the back to get a drink and used the bathroom, and Terry Funk said to me, he said, I'm watching the monitor back here. He said, that's the way wrestling matches should be called. You and Jim are doing a hell of a job. He said, how long have you worked together? And I looked at my watch. I said, about an hour and a half. He said, oh, bullshit. I said, no, Terry. This is the first time we'd ever been on a microphone together, So, but, yeah, so it was, I've been blessed to work. Well, and I mentioned Charlie Platten. Probably most people have heard of everybody else. Maybe not Ed Capro. Ed was the lead announcer in Atlanta for many years, and then he came up and worked with us in Charlotte for a while. But Charlie Platt did Southeastern wrestling out of Dothan, Alabama. Mm-hmm. And when I went down there out of Knoxville for a while, Charlie and I worked together down there, and they'd talk about somebody probably being underappreciated. Charlie would probably be one of those guys. But so that whole crew that I just mentioned that I was blessed to have had the opportunity to work with.
Yeah. So when did you decide that as far as in-ring competition that it was the end? And how does that decision come to be made? I mean,
well, in 19 actually I had my through the whole television thing, I was wrestling, so in November of 1974, well, actually, but right before that, Ron Fuller, he and I became very good friends in Tampa in 1971. Okay. In fact, his youngest son is my godson. Okay, and we became very good friends. So he bought the Knoxville territory from John Kazana. Right. I had been one of the top baby faces in Knoxville with Whitey Caldwell. We've been when John finally got television in there in late 68, early 69. I don't remember exactly. We were the first two baby faces to get over it, and so we were the guys that carried the babyface side for a couple of years there. But anyway. Ron called me. He said, I bought Kazana out in Knoxville. And he said, I know nothing about television. I want you to come in and build me a TV show. You have carte blanche, within reason, obviously, to put together a TV show. So here was a chance, like with the magazines, like with the T-shirts, I had a chance to create something. Uh-huh. And so anyway, I worked it out with Jimmy in Charlotte. So I still lived in Charlotte from November of 74 through November of 77. My schedule went like this. I had an apartment in Charlotte. I go in the office I had a cubicle in the office in Charlotte. I'd go in on Monday, and George Scott and I sit down and go over all the promos for all the towns, and realize back then there wasn't one TV that you had to insert all these. We did interviews in Raleigh on Wednesday from noon till 5:30.
Right. Yeah.
And two 2-minute 20-second promos for each town, and plus some if the guys are going out to another territory. But anyway, we would George and I'd sit down, and he would give me what I needed, the information for the Richmond show or for the whatever show it was, right? And so, the town, the date, the top couple matches, and I'd make up lead sheets, the television, spit it out, Les, under the television camera, when we were doing the promos. Yeah. And then I would probably wrestle that particular night. And so it was, I'd make the sheets up, might wrestle Monday night and Tuesday. Then I'd go to Raleigh TV on Wednesday morning, and we'd do the promos. And then for a while, I was doing Ed Kaplan and I were swapping back and forth on the B show. They dual taped. It was all the same show. Bob Cottle had a desk on one side of the ring. We had a desk on the other side, and they were taping it on two different reels at the same time with two different soundtracks.
Yeah.
So anyway, and then Thursday, maybe I was off, depended. And then Friday morning, I get on a plane, go to Knoxville. Ron and I would put the TV together, wrestle in Knoxville Friday night, do the TV Saturday morning, wrestle in whatever town, Newport, Morristown, Harlan, wherever, on Saturday night, get back on the plane Sunday, go back to Charlotte and do it all over again. So I did this from November of 74 through November of 77.
Man.
So I was passing myself in the air on Fridays and Sundays. Right there, I go. Here I am.
Yeah. Right.
So at some point, and at this point, I'm in my late 30s, and I've got 16, 17, 18 years in the ring, and it's just I decided in 1980 that. I'd pretty much accomplished what I was going to accomplish physically in the ring. And I realized as far as with magazines, television, and that sort of thing, that was more a future for me.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of wound it down in 1980, and that was the end of it.
Yeah.
But I got 20 good years in.
Yeah.
And so it was, it's. Hell, if I could today, Dave, when I work with these kids, I ask the good Lord, if I do these weekend camps, I ask the good Lord on Friday, could you just make me like 30 years old for the next 2 days, right?
Yeah, really.
Because I can show them better than I can tell them.
That's right.
It's just...
Yeah. So how long after that you kind of got out of in-ring? When was it you started doing the bodybuilding stuff?
Well, I started that when I moved home. I lived in Knoxville. Once I moved to Knoxville in 77, except for a run down on the Gulf Coast when Ron sold the territory to Barnett, and I stayed with Barnett for a while. Then I went down to the Gulf Coast, lived in Pensacola, and worked in the office there and did the TV with Charlie Platt and helped produce the television. And excuse me. And so when I got a phone call from Ric Flair and said Jimmy Crockett, Blackjack, and I bought the territory from Barnett, and we had been on Channel 10, which was a CBS affiliate at the time in Knoxville, and had great numbers there, and that's where I really got creative with a lot of stuff that's on TV today that's commonplace. We did for the first time on the Southeastern show. It was stuff that people told us wouldn't work, by the way, but it did.
Yeah.
And so anyway, Rick called me, and he said Lynn Lepper and Pete Finley, who were the programming director and the sales manager at Channel 10, will work with us and let us stay on Channel 10. But one of the things that they asked us to do for that was to bring you back to host and produce the show. Because when I first went there, we first went from Channel 26 in Knoxville, moved over to the CBS affiliate. I was kind of the go-between, that if, Les, can you change this on TV or maybe this or that? I mean, we never had any major problems with the station, and they were doing well. When we first started on Channel 10 in 1975, beginning of the year in 75, they were selling spots for I think $25 or $30. When Ron sold the territory to Barnett, they were getting $250 for a spot.
Wow.
And they had a couple. Well, a lot of sales managers looked down their nose at wrestling and didn't deal with it and just didn't work at it. But Lynn Lepper saw the value, and during that run there, when Ron still owned it, the University of Tennessee played Notre Dame at South Bend for the first time in umpty-ump number of years. I'm not sure what the deal was. But anyway, they were on the ABC affiliate, which was Channel 26. And they, 26 ran the show on TV, and they were in opposition to us on Channel 10. And in our hour, the best they could do was tie us in terms of rating. So if you understand the University of Tennessee and football in Knoxville, you know, that's doing something. So anyway, you know, that's so I went back and produced a show for Crockett and Rick and Blackjack. And so finally, there was a war there, too, but all the war there did was kill the territory, quite frankly. The city, Atlanta was big enough city that both offices profited for quite a while, and then Gunkel just couldn't, you know, she was blocked out with getting the fresh talent because of the NWA affiliation with our side.
Right.
And so it just finally, you know, they closed their doors. But in Knoxville, the city wasn't big enough to support two major, and they had got TV, and this was with Angelo Pompo's group, and some of our guys had jumped office, which didn't do anything for them or for us, as a matter of fact, but it just it ended up killing that territory. So anyway, I had in the meantime, I'd been there for a number of years and had opened a little refurbishing business, and so I was going to stay for a while, and I was freelance, and I was doing. I was going over to San Juan for Carlos Colon. Okay. At the time, Carlos was running Barbados and Trinidad, which are both English speaking. And so I'd go over, and we'd go down the other end of the aisle to a small TV station, and I would do openings and wraparounds and call the matches over the tapes that were going into Barbados and Trinidad. And then I was just freelancing basically in terms of television, and then doing had this little refurbishing business. We had 4 apartment complexes and I had a crew of 3 other guys, and so that was was going good. And so finally, I just decided my dad had passed away in '83, and so in '85 I decided it's time to go back to Cincinnati and be close to my mom and help her out. And so I came up here and started working. I'd helped design a couple gyms and build them and manage them, and I was working with bodybuilders. I just decided, I needed something. I needed an adrenaline rush, something to challenge me, right?
Yeah.
So at age 46, I did my first bodybuilding show, and so I thought I'll do one just to see how it goes. And so 13 shows later, and at age 54, I said, okay, it's enough. Yeah. and I quit. But I was still good. Well, during the time up here, I was working with Perilla Performance, and John worked with pro bodybuilders and so forth and so on. But I was doing the Smoky Mountain show for Cornette, and I've been up in New England for Savoldi, and doing his television and working with Kevin Sullivan. And I'd worked together as producer and booker for Mulligan and Crockett and Flair. Yeah. And we got a chance to work together again up there. And so anyway, that's how it was all going about. So I was just minding my own business here and doing Jimmy's TV. And so then the training thing came about actually by accident too.
Yeah, so tell us that. How did that all get started with Heartland and stuff there in Cincinnati?
Yeah, well, I was doing the competitive bodybuilding and working with bodybuilders and doing Smoky Mountains TV, and was very happy and carefree. And Bob Harmon, who was the original Beautiful Bobby for WWWF,
right.
Is a Cincinnati boy, and Bob and I were friends, and he broke in Boston too. Actually, I don't know if you knew this or not, Dusty broke in for Santos up there too.
Really? No, I didn't know.
Yeah, just 9 years after I did, but yeah, he broke in up there in '69, and I broke in '60. But so Bob Bob called me one day, and he said, there's a guy that's got a wrestling school here, and he's got an idiot, I mean, his words, not mine, he's got an idiot as a trainer who doesn't know enough, and he's going to end up losing his students if he doesn't get a competent trainer. And I said, okay, why are you telling me this? He said, because you're the guy that should be doing this. I said, you're out of your friggin' mind. Right? So, I never, well, as I look back at it, some of the guys that I worked with, Terry Taylor, J.J. Dillon, Bill, Scott Casey, tell me that I was a mentor in essence to them too, but I never looked at it like that. But anyway, so I said, Bob, he said, do me a favor. He said, they got a show Saturday night and please come and go to the show with me and let me introduce you to the boys and let's talk about it. I said, okay, because Bob and I had been friends for years. We'd traveled together, and so I said, okay. Now, I'd never been to an independent show at that time, Dave.
Oh, okay.
And when I went to this one, I was horrified. I thought, oh, my God. This is what my business has come to this, right?
Yeah, right.
This is 1992. Now.
Yeah.
And so I...
well, to be frank, now the product on TV wasn't a whole lot better in '92.
Well, yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah. Well, anything was a lot better than what I saw this particular
right,
night.
okay.
Take my word for it. And anyway, so we're sitting there with a guy who owns a school, Bob and I, and watching. And there's these two kids in the ring, and the one kid goes out and grabs a chair. And I could tell just by the way he was holding it, he didn't know what he was doing with it. Yeah. And I thought, well, he's just going to threaten with it. He's not going to really hit the kid. Oh, yes, he is. So he hit the kid and rung his bell, and the kid was kind of out on his feet. And the match, even at the end of the match with a disqualification, the kid that got hit with a chair was walking around in circles, and they had sent a couple other the kids out there to get him out of there. And so I said to Bob, the guy that owned the school, the promoter, was sitting on the other side. Bob was between the two of us. And I leaned over to Bob, and I said, this kid didn't have a clue what he was doing, that damn chair. How long has he been wrestling? How long has he been working? And Bob leaned over to the promoter and leaned back to me, and he said, he's been to 5 practices. I said, oh, my God. You don't even have a business being in a match, never mind, So I said, okay, I'll try this, right? So that's how it started. And when I went in with these kids, they were only working once a week. They were sharing a building with a karate school, and so they could only get in there on Saturdays and Sundays. So they were only training one day, and I said, no, that's not good. We're going to at least train to 2. And so that's how it started. And the first day I was with these kids, I said, here's the good and the bad news. The bad news is you guys are all going to start from scratch because you don't really have a clue. And the good news is we're going to do it right. And so that's how I started with training. And then the guy who I was doing the training for was a charlatan too, which I didn't know at the time. And so I decided with a couple of these kids, they wanted to, branch out. He started to get upset because he was the guru until I got there, and then they started to realize that he talked a lot of trash and didn't know much, which God knows how many guys are out there today as trainers who are the same, they're not trainers, they need to be trained. But anyway, so then we decided to, actually that was in 90 or 91, because, so we started, HWA started in 1992.
Yeah. Okay.
And actually, of all the things I've done in the wrestling business, being a promoter is the least exciting to me. I mean, but I realized that these kids I'm training needed a place, to try what they were learning.
Yeah.
So that's how the HWA. Well, I shouldn't say that because I did in '82 and '83. We skipped those years. I was running the tours for Georgia, WCW. Here in Ohio, Michigan, and West Virginia for Barnett and Ole.
Yeah, okay.
I ran the tours up here.
Yeah.
So that was a whole different ball game. So anyway, HWA started in 92 and late 91, early 92. And the rest, I guess, Dave, is history.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when a lot of people look back at your time in that era there, one of the things that immediately pops to mind is the Pillman Memorial shows that you did in the late 90s. I think you did 4 of them, right? And all, I think, started in 98. And,
98, 99, 2000, 2001 was the last one, yeah.
Yeah, and I know I've heard you tell stories of all the work and how much of a task it was, but it's pretty monumental what you pulled off, and the guys that were, I mean, it was really kind of a cross selection of talent from everywhere that was coming in to work these shows.
Yes.
Yeah, so.
Well, it was the only play by 2001, the mystique of all the major promotions being under the same roof at the same time was gone because Vince owned everything by this time.
Right.
But when we first started doing this, it was just going to be. There was never any long-term plan.
Yeah.
When Brian had the ankle fused, he had come up to my place to. Well, if you read his the book. The biography.
Yeah.
There's a whole chapter. There's a whole chapter on the Pillman shows in there.
Yep, right.
And it's well done. I mean, it's very honest and truthful. But anyway, he was, I mean, it was sad to watch because there was a young guy with a lot of talent, and he was just, he tried different boots and he was trying different things, and I said to him one time, I said, all you're doing is you're putting all your pressure on the good ankle, the good leg, and you're going to end up ruining it. I said, you've got to stop worrying about flying in the air and this and that and the other thing, and just learn to work ground. Wrestle on the mat. Your days of the big crazy bumps are pretty much over. But anyway, so when he passed away, the thought was, let's do a little memorial show for Brian. So. We got the junior high school gym where he went to school in Norwood, suburb of the city here. And so it started out with just, who's this? Benoit and Jericho decided they were friends of Brian, and they would come and do a match. And then, now, of course, Austin and him were partners, and of course, Jericho and Chris at the time were with WCW. So, of course, Austin wasn't going to wrestle, but him and Sonny were coming to represent WWF at the time. And so, in talking to Dave Meltzer about this, Dave said, well, now all you need is ECW, and they have all 3 major companies, which kind of sparked an idea to me. So Chris Candido, of course, was married to Sonny.
Yep. And
Chris and I had become real good friends with, besides the wrestling, the weight room and the bodybuilding in Smokey. So I called. I didn't know. I'd never met Paul Heyman at the time.
Yeah.
And so I called Chris and I said, hey, if we get you on this show here. And I said at the time, Al Snow was kind of working both sides of the street, as it were. He was in ECW, but he was also had been under contract to Vince.
Yeah.
And I said, Al lives right up the road here in Lima, and we could put you guys in a match. And so Chris got back to me and said Paul signed off on it. So I left a message on Meltzer's voicemail. I said I just hit the trifecta. So that was how the whole thing started. We didn't know what we would draw, quite frankly.
Right.
And the junior high school gym with the ring set up and floor seats, we put about 1,200 people in there, and we turned away 300 or 400.
Yeah. Wow.
And it was just an amazing thing, and it was so at the end of this whole thing, it's like, oh, wow. But then I thought, well, we could do this again, right?
Yeah.
Like a dummy. So and you talk. Yeah, it was. We had a committee, and to handle catering, because we had CW and ECW paid for the guys' plane tickets to come in. We took care of the hotel. We fed them. We saw that they had a gym to work out in if they wanted to work out. We we had volunteers to drive them wherever they needed to go and so forth. We picked them up at the airport and took them back to the airport and all the above. And of course, the three major promotions paid for their plane fare. And this was their day off, and these guys were working for nothing. And that first show in the junior high school gym, Terry Taylor was WCW at the time, and he was sitting up in the grandstands with me watching Benoit and Jericho.
Yeah.
And he said, hell, Les, he said, they work harder for you for nothing than they work for us for money.
Yeah.
But it was that way, Dave. I mean, there was never a open competition like we're going out there and have a match you guys can't follow. But it was a lot of, and everybody, it was a lot of energy in the building. I mean, it was special.
Yeah.
It wasn't because I made it special or because anybody in particular made it special. It just, that's the way it came about.
Yeah.
And everybody put on their work. And I use the Benoit. I mentioned Benoit and Regal. I used their match from 2000 as a teaching tool.
Yeah.
It's a classic.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a friggin' classic.
Yeah.
So there's always something special. In 2000, we had hoped to have Flair and Austin both here.
Yeah.
But we didn't. But Flair, Rick was here, and Steve couldn't make it. But this was when Mark Curtis, Brian Hildebrand, was suffering from stomach cancer.
Yeah, right.
And I remember his wife calling me at the gym and saying, he was being fed through a port.
Yeah.
And he was losing weight, and she called. She said, "I'm taking him to the hospital. He wanted me to call you and let you know if you called that everything was okay." And I could hear Brian in the background yelling, "Tell him I'll be at the show. Tell him I'm going to be at the show." This was the show in '99.
Yeah.
The second one.
Yeah.
And so the idea was for the main event in that one was Benoit and Malenko against Conan and Ray.
Yeah.
Mysterio.
Uh-huh.
And so the idea was to have Mark referee the main event. And so anyway, I said, okay, just tell him to take care of himself. So he gets there, and I told him, I said, okay, I was teasing Terry Taylor and Dr. Tom worked. I called it the old timers match. Of course, they weren't that old at the time, but I said you referee Terry and Tommy's match because it won't be as intense or it won't move as fast, and so he said, well, okay, if that's what you want. So anyway, I was doing the ring announcing myself that year, and so I go out to introduce the main event, and here comes Mark out of the dressing room, and he probably at the time wasn't 130 pounds. Yeah, and but what a heart this guy! I mean, pound for pound, the toughest SOB. I loved him to death. I mean, he fought through this like a champ. Anyway, so he gets in the ring. I said, I didn't think you were going to do this. He said, well, I'm out here. And I said, well, that I can tell. He said, I said, you all right? He said, yeah. He said, but are you going to stay out here by the ring for to watch the match? I said, yeah. He said, well, if I can't make it, you can carry my ass back to the back. And, so there was always something special about it. But that Benoit Regal match in 2000 at the Schmidt Fieldhouse at Xavier University, my God. Yeah, that was just blow away great. They had 2,000 people on their feet before that thing was over. So yeah, those shows were special, and I'm proud of them. But there were so many people. Well, the guys first of all, the guys coming in here on their day off and working their butts off, and giving their time, but I had a committee here that helped with the setting up transportation, catering, et cetera, and we started having meetings once a week, 7 months out, getting ready for this thing. So, but yeah, those were great. I'm proud of them and proud of everybody who got involved in it. Yeah.
Well, and you're still at it, right? I mean, you're doing lots of seminars and stuff now. Tell us about
the more the merrier. I tell you what, my creditors wish I were doing more. Quite frank.
Well, tell us about what if we have a potential promoter out there or a potential group out there. It's looking to bring Les Thatcher in for a seminar. Tell us about it. Sell them on it right now if they're listening.
Well, they can reach me, Les at epwt.com or Les Thatcher at zoomtown.com. I'll be more than happy to send them the information. I prefer doing weekends, like a Saturday, Sunday, Dave, simply because you get more time you have with the kids, the better, it is, the more comfortable they are, and the more you can teach them. I feel that if you give me 2 days and the kids will pay attention, I'll send them away with something that will improve their in-ring talent.
Yeah.
But I cover everything. I cover tag team, singles, psychology, conditioning, et cetera, just virtually everything to do with the business. And normally we start the promoters will fly me in on Friday. Sometimes we do a Q&A on Friday night, and then we start training like around 9 or 10 Saturday morning, break for an hour for lunch, train then till, if they have a show on Saturday evening, I'll help out. I'll sit in and do color, help in the dressing room, whatever. And we'll train all day, do the same schedule on Sunday, and then we'll train till 5 or 6 o'clock Sunday evening, then send me home on Monday.
Yeah.
You can go EPWT, Elite Pro Wrestling Training, is a website that started. Harley Race and Ricky Steamboat and I started doing what we called super camps back in 2004.
Yeah.
And we actually have, it's out of print now, but we did a training manual called the Professional Wrestlers Workout and Instructional Guide that was put out by Sports Publishing LLC, and they went out of business. But you can still, they tell me they're out there on Amazon for as much as $300 or $400. Wow. I wish I had a couple of cases of them. I'd love to sell some.
Yeah, really.
But Harley and Ricky and I did that particular training manual, and then we did these camps together. But EPWT, Elite Pro Wrestling Training, is a website, and you can go on there, and there are testimonials of promoters and wrestlers that I've worked with, and so I feel very confident that I give something back, and I'd love to be doing 1 or 2 of these every month if I could.
Yeah.
And I've been I was under contract at WWE for actually both companies, WCW and WWE, and I did the performance. I was a guest coach at the Performance Center last year. And I think I'm going back again after the first of the year to do another week down there. So, and if you've seen Nigel McGuinness wrestle, or Shark Boy, or B.G. Whitmer,
all those guys,
Carl Anderson, or
straight out of Heartland, aren't they?
yeah, that's where they started.
That's right. Yeah,
exactly.
It's it's like any business out there, right? Any profession. You never stop learning, and you always have to go back and get refresher classes and some further training. So really, no matter where you're at, there's always more to learn. So I'd highly suggest these guys bring you in to do these seminars. And as we've talked about here for almost an hour and a half, there's no aspect of the business that you've not been there and done that. So you can help in so many ways.
Sir. Yes, sir. The only thing I've haven't done in 58 and a half years, Dave, is get rich.
Yeah, well.
I've missed the boat there.
Yeah,
but I feel blessed. I've lived enough life, I guess, for 3 people, and I feel that I've contributed a lot to the business in different capacities, and I hope to continue to do something till the good Lord decides it's time to go home.
That's right. Well, tell everybody. We talked about your seminar. You're also on social media, right? You have a Twitter and things. How can they follow you to keep up with you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and on Facebook, and I work with Rudy Gonzalez, who was the head trainer for Shawn Michaels, and I do at least one camp a year at the Monster Factory, and the One Fall Power Factory, which is Ray Lloyd Glacier and QT Marshall. Right. Which is a ROH subsidiary in Atlanta. Yep. I work with them, and but I'm available. Please feel free to get in touch with me. I'll be more than happy to send you out the information. And like I say, you can see testimonials from various guys, in terms of that, some of the guys now in 205, Tony Nese, Drew Gulak are both guys that I've worked with. Cedric Alexander. It's just so a lot of a lot of these guys I didn't start, but I've had some influence on their training and on their their talent, and I'm proud to watch them all. They're all good kids.
Yeah. So I highly advise everybody to go out there, follow you on Twitter, connect with you on Facebook. And again, if you've got a promotion out there and you want to, enhance your product, enhance your talent, then reach out to Les and work with him and set something up, bring him in. He can only bring more to your product. So, Les, we thank you.
And my creditors would appreciate
absolutely,
it. Absolutely,
yeah. Let's. Les says he's not gotten rich yet, so let's all work together. Let's try to make Les rich.
Send me to my grave with some wealth.
Yeah, that's right. And if you're not in the business, or whatever, so Les, like we said earlier, Les has a Pro Wrestling Tee store, so go on and buy a shirt or a dozen or so, and help him out there. Yeah. I mean, any way you can.
There you go.
Let's help Les get rich. So, well, Les, we appreciate you coming on and talking with us for so long and talking about everything you've done in your career. It was truly an
Dave.
honor.
I appreciate you having me on,
absolutely.
And it's. I'd say let's do it again, but I don't know what we could cover.
Oh, well, I'm sure we can figure something out sometime. So, but again, like I said, follow Les out there on social media. Keep up and follow what he's doing, and go check out his website and what he's doing, those testimonials and his seminars. And Les, thank you for coming on, and we'll catch up and we'll talk to you again in the future. So,
all right, great, David. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
You've heard him here on the Dave Dynasty Show as a guest and as host of the monthly Graham's Gallery episodes, and now you can hear his stories. You can own a copy of Confessions of a Big-Time Wrestler, the audio book from Dr. Jerry Graham Jr., former multi-tag team champion in WWA and owner of Bruiser Bedlam. You can hear all of his encounters with the various wrestlers, places, and promotions he's worked as he tells about his colorful, long, and illustrious career. You can have your own copy for only $25, and that includes shipping and handling. It's very simple. Go on Facebook, look up Jerry Jaffe, Jaffe, send him a private message, and make arrangements to purchase a copy of Confessions of a Big-Time Wrestler now. You will not regret this purchase. And welcome back to the Dave Dynasty Show. I am Dave Dynasty. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Special thanks to George Schire for coming on and being a special co-host today. I love hearing stories from George. Hope to have him on again in the near future to tell lots more stories, really dive into some Midwest wrestling there, especially there in Minnesota with the AWA and so on. George is a wealth of knowledge and information. Thank you very much for coming on. And, of course, thank you to Les Thatcher as we wrap up that interview with part 2 today. It was great talking to him. I'm sure we'll follow up again in the future. He's got so much knowledge and wealth and experience and stories to tell that I cannot not talk to him again. So thank you, Les, for doing that. And thank you for joining us, however you do. Just make sure you visit DaveDynasty.com. That is your central hub for all of our activities. You can find all of our social media links there. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can donate to the show to keep it free and running smoothly at patreon.com/TheDaveDynasty or paypal.me/TheDaveDynasty. And the best way probably to help us out and you get something also is to go to our Pro Wrestling Tees store. You can find that link at DaveDynasty.com or just go to ProWrestlingTees.com and look up Dave Dynasty Show. We have the classic Dave Dynasty Show logo. We have the Midwest Express shirt. Of course, we have the Dr. Jerry Graham Jr. shirt. And we have the new shirt, which is now available. The Slapowitz Syndicate, officially endorsed and promoted by Izzy Slapowitz. Go get that shirt. Support us. Support Izzy. Support Dr. Graham. Support everything we're doing here. We're trying to bring a little light on Midwest wrestling and its history. And support the scene now, at least the parts of the scene now that we feel deserve supporting. So go on and order a shirt and do your part to support, be a part of the Midwest Express. We do appreciate that. Make sure you follow us on all those social media links. That helps us a lot. Subscribe to us wherever you listen to us. And if you listen to us on iTunes, give us a 5-star rating and review. Please, we appreciate that. So again, thank you for joining us. I am Dave Dynasty. This is the Dave Dynasty Show. We will see you next week. And until then, be good, be safe, and keep on growing.